Okay, so a bit of a reminder from Wednesday. We had a bit of a deviation Wednesday from talking about apologetics to more so just talking about history and historical science. How do we know events in history occurred as we believe they did? So we kind of gathered some information about different types of historical evidences, whether that's documents or physical evidence, artifacts, things we might find through archaeology or through things that are left behind from historical events. And that can also be accounts, whether primary accounts, firsthand eyewitness accounts, followed by secondary accounts, people who are referencing the people who were eyewitnesses. And we talked a little bit about things like news and articles, and how do we evaluate what's good and what's a valuable resource and what's not. The next thing we did is we started approaching the Gospels and asking ourselves the question, what are some of the things that the Gospel writers do to establish that the things that they're writing are history, that these are not a collection of stories, or these are not a collection of letters that were cobbled together by the early church to try to add legitimacy to their movement. And so we started in Luke chapter 1, where Luke, probably more so than any of the Gospel writers, really announces the intentions of his book in the first chapter, where he is laying out a history. He is laying out a record of his eyewitness testimony to the things that have occurred for the purpose of being there for posterity as an evidence for the things that have happened. We talked about a little bit some of the things that he mentions. One, that he acknowledges the recent nature of events. He acknowledges his status as being an eyewitness to the things that have occurred. And we also mentioned that Luke goes an extra mile of citing specific names and events that happened in that time period in history, which is something that adds credence to his writings. He is referencing things that can be corroborated through other historical narratives and through other historical records. You can go back through the records of Roman leaders, and you can see Herods and Tetrarchs, and you can see which Caesars were in power at the times of these events. So that's another thing that leads to historical credibility. I want to continue doing that this morning, so I hope you've had some opportunity to look through the Gospels, maybe do some research on your own. I say that too because I have not had a lot of opportunity to study this weekend, so I am going to be relying on you a little bit more this morning. So I hope you are prepared. So as we think about the Gospels, maybe we can be turning to when I think about the first chapter of Luke. The next thing I think about is near the end of the book of John, where John is talking about the nature of his writing as being written for evidence. In John chapter 20 is where he makes this note. It's after the account of the resurrection. It's after the account of Thomas being persuaded by seeing the resurrected Lord. I think it's fitting that John writes this here after he writes about Thomas, because the whole story of Thomas is sort of a story of somebody being convinced of something that they were unwilling to believe until they saw it, right? Thomas was saying, I am not going to believe that my Savior, that my Lord is risen until I see him myself, until I can touch him. And so John gives us that account. Jesus says to him, put your finger here, see my hands, put out your hand, place it in my side. Do not be disbelieving. My Bible has a typo right here. It says no, it doesn't. It says do not disbelieve, but believe. I thought it said something else. Do not disbelieve, but believe. Thomas answered him, my Lord and my God. Jesus said to him, have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. So, pausing right there just for a second. That's the condition of any of us who are looking at history, right? History is something that we have not seen, and yet from the accounts, from the evidence, and from the sources that tell us about events that have happened in the past, we believe. If you remember last week, we used the example of George Washington. We all believe in George Washington. None of us think that he's a hoax. Well, I mean, maybe you think he's a hoax. I'd love to hear your thoughts if that's the case. That would be a very interesting discussion. But we haven't seen, and yet we believe. Jesus is saying that here, that there will be those who have not seen and yet believe. They will take the history, they will take the evidence that has been left behind by the apostles and by the early church, and they will still believe, even if they can't touch the risen Savior themselves. Verse 30, John says, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." And so he adds that note in there after Jesus makes a statement about belief and evidence and seeing, to tell us that there are other things that I didn't even record. But this book serves as the synopsis guide. This book of John, is his attempt at laying these things out. The same thing Luke was trying to do, John tries to do here. I'm laying this out so that you can know I saw these things happen. I saw these things occur. I saw more than even what I'm writing to you, but this is written so that you may believe. So, now I'll turn it over to you all. What are some other ways that you see the gospel writers trying to establish the historical nature of the events? It could be explicit statements like the ones in Luke or John, or it could be sort of internal evidence within the text, things that stand out to you as this lends credibility to these being historical accounts rather than stories.
You mentioned gospel writers. It's not in the gospel, but 1 John.
Right?
They're in the first couple of, the first verse there. How he not only heard it, we have heard, but seen it with our own eyes and our hands touched. So that primary eyewitness.
Mm-hmm. Right, so John, here writing in his epistles rather than his gospel account, is talking about being an eyewitness. He names himself and says, not only did I see, I touched, I was there. That is a very bold statement of being a primary source. And I think it's important to note that the epistles, I may be wrong about this, but I think the Gospels are the latest books to be added to the New Testament, essentially. Most of the Gospels were written at the end of the life of the apostles. John being the last of those written. John is one of the last books in the New Testament that we have. His letters would have come much sooner. So really, the letters and the testimony of John to the churches as he was writing to those came before he wrote down everything that he wrote in the book of John, the Gospel of John. One of those sources I was looking at was talking about how the gospel, before we had Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the gospel didn't mean those books. The gospel meant the story of Jesus, the news about Jesus that was mostly delivered through spoken word. It was delivered when they came to the churches, they preached to them, they delivered their testimony of what they had seen and heard and experienced. That was the gospel. And the books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, came when the apostles were reaching the end of their lives, the end of the time when they were preaching, and they said, we need to write this down. We got to get this written down so that it can be preserved once we're gone, once we are no longer there to offer our witness in person as people who saw this. Just something to kind of remember, when we're thinking about the function of these books, that they do come later than some of the other epistles. I think I noted in here that the writings of Paul, some of his writings come around AD 50, AD 54. That's about only 20 years or so after AD 30, when the end of Jesus' life. Whereas the Gospels come, we can trace pretty reliably most of the Gospels to at least prior to AD 60, but they come 10 to 20 years after some of the epistles, especially the ones that Paul writes. That was a lot to branch off of what you said, but the note from 1 John, thank you for that the writers of the Gospels are eyewitnesses. I think that's a good one to look at. I saw Jim and then Dad.
2 Peter 1, verse 16, where Peter talks about we were made known the power of the coming of the Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty.
Okay, so Peter there is also doing the same thing John's doing, where he's saying outright, I am an eyewitness. I saw this happen myself. I believe it's also the sort of common traditional understanding of the book of Mark is that John Mark wrote basically the perspective of Peter, that it is Peter's Peter's view of things that happened, written down by John Mark, is actually how we get the book of Mark. Some people think it's written by Mark, but it's intent, and it is written by John Mark, intended to be the perspective of Peter. So here we have two cases where we have epistle letters written by John and Peter, and then we have, at a later date, Gospels that are added to the New Testament from John's perspective and from Peter's perspective, if we think about the book of Mark being from Peter's perspective. Dad?
The willingness of the writers to use both place names, travel distances, proximities, as well as, I think, purposefully mentioning different governors, tetrarchs, rulers that could be time-stamped to know when their rule was in secular history. These are both things that you have to be able to point out to those that would have been contemporaries. Well, I was there that day. This didn't happen that way, etc.
Right, right. So the Gospels are willing to give intimate details about the knowledge of first century Jerusalem and Palestine. In fact, first half of the first century, first 30 years of the first century Jerusalem, Palestine. There's mentions made in in the accounts that Jesus speaks of. There are figures and images used that were common to the time period and match our knowledge of what that historical time period looked like. References like, and I know there's differing interpretations on this parable, but the camel passing through the eye of the needle. I've heard people say before, there was a gate in Jerusalem that was really narrow called the Needle Gate. I don't tend to think that that's the point Jesus was making in the parable, but that is a historical item that potentially matches a reference or an example that Jesus and the apostles wrote down. In mentioning names, we talked about Herod being mentioned in the beginning of Luke. You have mentions of who was Caesar, who was the emperor of Rome at certain time periods. I believe it was during the days of Augustus that Christ was born, and you had the census. That's a historical event that can be verified through external history. We mentioned on Wednesday Caiaphas and Annas being mentioned both as high priests, and one of the things we pointed out on Wednesday was look at where accounts differ. That's one of the ways that historians evaluate whether something is right, or at least catches the attention of historians, is when accounts differ, that's when you really need to pay attention. Why are these two stories different? And so we read in one gospel the high priest was Annas, and we read in one that the high priest was Caiaphas. Well, an examination of history tells us that makes sense if these books are written to perhaps a slightly different composition of audience. One was the high priest in the eyes of the Jews. He was given legitimacy by Jewish citizens, and the other high priest was more of a puppet high priest set up by the Roman ruling authority, he wasn't seen as a legitimate high priest by the Jews, but he still was considered high priest. That kind of discrepancy matches with history. So it's not a mistake, it's not oops, the authors got it wrong and they slipped and used the wrong name. There is an explanation for why that discrepancy exists, and it even adds credibility to these authors knew what they were talking about. They weren't making stuff up and just making mistakes right and left. I was going through William Lane Craig's book, and he had a chapter about the resurrection. And he first was laying out some of the past arguments that have been used in laying down a case for the Gospels being authentic, that they are actually written by the disciples of Jesus, and that if they're authentic, if we can say they are written by the apostles, then we have to basically then say, okay, well, are they telling the truth or are they lying? But we know that they're written by the apostles. He says the Gospels are written in a living and simple tone. So if you compare the Gospels to other books of the Bible even, there is not the same prophetic language in the Gospels, unless Jesus is specifically quoting prophecy or making a prophecy. The narrative voice of the Gospels is a simple tone. It is a simple narrative voice, such that you would use if you were describing history. It's not meant to be metaphorical or images. It just simply states what happened and what the reality of the situation was. And he notes that they are written with a keen knowledge of Jerusalem prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And this was an interesting point made here that I found interesting. An interesting point I found interesting. Because the Gospels do not mention the destruction of Jerusalem. They mention Jesus' prophecies about the destruction of Jerusalem, but they do not mention the event itself. Historians have said this lends a lot of credibility to the fact that these books were probably first written before AD 70. Otherwise, it probably would have been in the interest of the early church to mention those events. Not only do you have the prophecy, but you have the destruction of Jerusalem mentioned as well. In fact, all of the New Testament does not mention the destruction of Jerusalem as a past event. It's always a forthcoming event, leading us to believe that it's not made mention of because it hadn't occurred yet. So, just another point there. There's no attempt within the Gospels to suppress discrepancies or to try to harmonize them as a forger might do. So if you were trying to fake the Bible and make it look like many people had written it, but it was really one person or one committee trying to make it work, you would probably go through a few rounds of editorial process, right? And you would proofread it a little bit, and you would catch things like Annas and Caiaphas, and you'd say, "Oh, people might get confused by that. Let's switch the names. Let's get it so that it's unified. Let's get one story here." And you don't see that happening. You see a willingness for the Gospels to show differing events from different points of view. It doesn't mean that both viewpoints couldn't have both happened. They're just descriptors of the same event told from different perspectives. Other thoughts? Jim?
In Acts 13, where Paul and Barnabas are on Cyprus, and there is a mention of the proconsul, and skeptics have said that there was no proconsul on Cyprus. But recent, I don't know how we say, the last 50 years, there's excavations that brought through that actually said that there was things written in stone of the proconsul in Cyprus.
Right.
So archaeologically proved historical fact.
Okay, so there's examples of archaeological findings, actual physical evidence findings of describing things that are written about in the Bible. So before we knew that the physical artifacts were there, before we had found the physical artifacts, the Bible told us that something existed, a proconsul in Cyprus in this example. And then later, another piece of physical evidence, some other historical writing or carving makes mention of the same thing and matches what we would describe. I think another example of that is some of the geography of the city of Jerusalem. I think it's the pool, either the pool of Shalom or the pool of Hezekiah, maybe, the cistern of Hezekiah. They're mentioned in the Gospels, and those locations in the ancient city of Jerusalem have now been found and identified. We know where those existed. Go ahead, Brace. Oh, did you have a hand up, Brace?
No,
Oh,
I
okay.
was just saying, that happens a lot, that critics of the Bible will say, well, we don't see any record of that in the external history, and therefore the Bible got it wrong. And then later some archaeological discovery finds a piece of evidence that shows that the Bible was right all along. Sargon II in the Old Testament's an example of that too.
Mm-hmm. Right. Joy?
You're talking about discrepancy, that fear, quote, unquote, discrepancies in the Bible. Another way that it's confirmed is that even though they're saying that, yet there's consistency between the very beginning, the first chapter of Genesis to the end of Revelation, over the entire number of years that it took to write the Bible, even in obscure notes. There are things that they even missed that, prove it. They're obscure.
Right. Yeah, I heard a critic talking about, we shouldn't marvel that people have a deep, intimate knowledge of all the details of the Bible and how they harmonize and how they work together. And he brought up the example of Harry Potter fans. And Harry Potter fans know there's a lot of books, there's a lot of pages in those books, and they love to pick over all the details and look at how these details are interconnected and how they all speak to one another. But a key point there is one person wrote those books, right? One person crafted a story and intentionally put in this interconnectivity. Whereas in the case of the Bible, we have not only many authors, we have authors writing over a span of multiple hundreds of years, 400, 500, 600 years between times when the books of the Bible, especially between the Old Testament and the New Testament, were written. So that's a bigger gap and a hurdle to get over than we think it is, because when you're writing something, just imagine, okay, if I pulled out a text from 1200 AD or 1300 AD, a 700 or 600-year-old book, and then I said about, okay, I'm going to write a follow-up to this and make it all mesh. I can't even read Old English, for one. That's a problem. The difference in how languages are, the differences in how cultures understand their communication, their language, their use of idioms and poetry, even though through the span of those years and through the difference, someone trying to write the Gospels down and make it mesh with Isaiah would have had the same difficulty of me trying to make a sequel to Beowulf and have it sound like it's one unified work, coming together. And yet the fact, as you pointed out, Joy, that there is this unity and there is this agreement between the books of the Bible, even across those spans of time, is evidence for its being divinely authored and authoritative, I think. We're getting a little off track from talking about the Gospels, but that's okay. I think these are good points being made here. Any other thoughts about specifically the Gospel accounts? Or if not, I want to mention a couple other things here. I don't see any hands. Let me just check my notes. One thing here. Going back to what I was reading the other night by William Craig, he gives a couple other items for the validity of the Gospels. He says that there was an eventual archiving of the apostles' accounts. So the fact that the Gospels became these books that got copied and passed on shows that there was some kind of reverence or importance given to these books. It's not proof or conclusive evidence all by itself, but it's a reason why we would expect there was some reason why the Gospels were important, because they got copied so much and they got distributed so much. He makes another point here that there is a chain, he calls it a chain of historical citation. So early church authors, some of the earliest church authors that we have the works of, they cite the Gospels, and they use the Gospels as authoritative sources, and they cite them as Scripture. He says that they get cited, the Gospels become cataloged very early on in the history of the church, and there are commentaries written about them very early on in the Christian church. And he also mentions that this is not the case for some of the apocryphal books of the New Testament or some of the other Gospels that didn't make it into the New Testament canon. One of the reasons Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were so early on established to be authentic is because they were treated with these commentaries because they were established as being authentic so early. There are other books that have been claimed from time to time to be Gospels, but they didn't have the same amount of citing and commentary written about them very, very early on. And that's one of the reasons that they got excluded. There just wasn't really that same level of proof and same level of criticism there. Okay. I wanted to run through some information that I found just to show you a little bit also of some of the evidence here. This was a thing I listened to that was talking about a case for the Gospels being recent. Remember, we talked about when it comes to historical documents, something that is close to the events when they occurred, as long as it's a holistic understanding of those events, we want it to be close to the events when they occurred. So critics would say the Gospels are written after the fact. They're written many, many years after the fact. Jesus is long dead. The apostles are possibly long dead, and they're just written post hoc to explain Christianity. So he goes through about, he's got like 11 different points here, and I just wanted to kind of briefly go through these. And as we're doing this, think about how each of these examples of the Gospels that we have from some date, once we find one that is earlier, it lends further credence to the later ones being authentic and being reliable, and you'll start to see what I mean here. It starts with claims that are pretty well embraced. So 200 AD, we have what's called the Baldmere papyri, or papyruses. They're found in Egypt. They contain the text of the book of John, the latest of the four Gospels. By that time, the other Gospels are already in circulation. 200 AD, there is basically no secular scholar that would contest that the Gospels are written down and they are in circulation by this time. Okay, well, we can go further back. We can go to 180 AD, 20 years prior. The Diatessaron is another text. It it became a standard text written by Tessian, the Assyrian. It contains all 4 Gospels. So 180 AD, there's very concrete examples of the Gospels there. We can go to 150 AD. Justin Martyr is writing in 150 AD, and he quotes the Gospels in his writings. He is the teacher of Tessian, who wrote the Diatessaron. So, okay, we know that the Gospels were around and in circulation before 150. 130 AD, there's Eusebius. He mentions someone named Papias, who we don't really have examples of his works. This is an example where we know about a historian because another historian quotes him. So Papias writes about other ancient scholars, and he mentions Matthew and Mark had written their Gospels by that time, and he contains fragments of John's Gospel found from the same time period. So we're at 130 AD. We can go to 120 AD. There's Polycarp. He quotes Gospels and other letters that are going to the Philippian church. Polycarp was an early church leader. He wrote to the church in Philippi. So he writes he indicates that I'm getting a little confused here. He mentions the Gospels and speaks about them in his writings as if they already possessed copies of the Gospels. He asks them to refer to the Gospels in his writing. So what this tells us is by 120 AD, churches possessed the Gospels. They had it in their ownership. And so it was viewed as Scripture, and it was something that could be quoted and referenced by preachers or by church leaders when they were trying to make a point from Scripture. So that's 120. We can go earlier. We can go to 110 AD. We have writings from the Bishop of Antioch, one of the elders at the Church of Antioch. He quotes the book of Matthew. Pre-100 AD, there's a text called the Didache. This is a sidebar, but I had never heard about this before, and I was kind of interested in learning about it. It appears to be kind of almost like an early pamphlet or tract. The Didache is sort of a summary of how to be a Christian when you're a new convert, and it was written before 100 AD. It includes things like Matthew's account of the Lord's Prayer and other key points in the teachings of Christ that we find mirrored in the Gospels. 95 AD, we have Clement writing. He quotes Matthew's Gospel again. Pre-70 AD, this is when we have the siege of Jerusalem. Titus destroys the temple. It's predicted in the Gospels, but not described in the New Testament. So we already talked about this, that the fact that the Gospels mention the coming destruction of Jerusalem, but they do not speak of it as a past event, is internal evidence where we can infer that these are written down before 70 AD. And then finally, he mentions before 64 AD, there are titles to political figures, there are customs mentioned, and there are locations mentioned in the book of Acts. And yet the book of Acts does not mention the martyrdom of James, which occurred in 61 AD. So the author here was kind of saying, this is some of the earliest, we're not getting to hard, concrete papyri or pieces of text or fragments of text, but contextually we can infer that pre-64 or even pre-61 AD, we have the Gospels still being written down. All that just goes to show that secular scholars will accept 200 AD or 180 AD, but this chain of citation where the mentions of the Gospels remain consistent, even though we go further and further back in time, it lends more and more credibility to it is probably sometime in those earlier dates, not those later dates when the Gospels are fabricated or when they get generated. It's just, if you look at 64 AD, we're talking about easily within the lifespan of everybody who could have seen or knew about Jesus. If these were 20 to 30 to 40-year-old men in 30 AD, they're now in 64 AD, they'd be, 50 to 70-year-old men, certainly within the realm of possibility. I don't know if you find that interesting. I just thought that chain of citation where we can go further and further and further and further back, and we still see examples of the Gospels being cited as authoritative. I found that interesting. Any questions or comments? No? All right. Well, let's talk about Paul a little bit here. Let me go back to the questions so I'm not getting too far off track. So the questions say, the Gospels are generally thought to have been written beginning about 40 years after the death of Jesus, potentially, at the latest. Paul's writings are unique because they come much sooner after the resurrection. Paul's writings are thought to begin around AD 54, a mere 20 years or so after the events that he describes in 1 Corinthians 15. So in 1 Corinthians 15, if you went back and read there for reference as you were working on the lesson, Paul is talking about the resurrection of Christ. He devotes an entire chapter to the fact that Christ is raised, and that because Christ is raised from the dead, it is the cornerstone of our faith. The Christian faith is one that says you will have eternal life just like Christ. And so Paul is making that point in 1 Corinthians 15. So he is writing about it as a very, very important event. So Paul believes in the resurrection. The question here is, what are some ways that Paul tries to establish the historical efficacy of his claims? And some of those examples we already mentioned about calling yourself an eyewitness testimony. Paul does this multiple times. He does this in Acts. There's a record of Paul's conversion, but Acts also records Paul recounting his conversion and telling his conversion to other people. So Paul witnessed the resurrected Christ not immediately after his resurrection, but later. He was shown in a vision, or he was shown in person. Jesus revealed himself to Paul and converted him. Were you able to think of any other ways that Paul establishes that he is an eyewitness of these events, that he is a believer because these things really took place?
I'm trying to think of what, maybe you just said it, but the one where he talks about Christ first appearing to Peter and then to like multiple other people, like 500 at once or something. I can't think of what passage that is.
Yes, I know the reference that you're referring to, and he speaks of himself as being one out of time, or as one born out of time. He also revealed himself to me. So Paul he's doing a couple things there, right? One is he is acknowledging the summary collection of people who are eyewitnesses. He's saying, I'm not the only one. We are many. There are many eyewitnesses that have come before me, and I am also one because God saw fit to reveal himself to me as one born out of due season, I think is the way he phrases it in some translations. Okay, I think that's a good one.
Andrew,
Yes.
you see in Galatians, he talks about being accepted by the apostles and correcting them, and the intimate relationship he had with Barnabas, and how Barnabas knew the apostles, and that kind of concretes his presence with them.
Okay. Is that, where in Galatians is that?
The second chapter, he talks about being accepted by the apostles and then opposing Peter.
Okay, yes. He says there's very concrete mentions he makes. In verse 1, he says, after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. I went up because of a revelation and set before them, though privately before those who seemed influential, the gospel that I proclaimed among the Gentiles. So then dropping down to verse 11, but when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles, but when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. So what's going on here is that Paul is acknowledging other characters who are also gospel writers, and he's kind of inserting himself in there as one of their contemporaries. And they viewed Paul as a contemporary. I think there's another principle here. We kind of mentioned this on Wednesday. There's another principle here at play. Do you remember the criterion of embarrassment that we talked about on Wednesday? That these authors wouldn't really have a motivation to write something embarrassing about themselves. Well, here is Paul writing about something embarrassing about Peter. And if Peter was, one of the co-conspirators of making this whole Christian thing take off, Peter really wouldn't want to see himself defaced like this, right? Peter wouldn't want it to be known about him that he was holding on to his prejudice. Peter needed to learn to be accepting of the Gentiles, and he was prejudiced. He wasn't really ready to let go of that, and Paul had to confront him about it. We see Peter, the early church history, venerates Peter in a lot of ways as one of the key elders of the early church. I think it was it in Jerusalem where Peter was an elder? I can't remember now. But there wouldn't be a reason to do that if all these men were trying to work together. Okay, let's make an account that convinces people and tricks people into believing these things. So I like that example there. Thank you for that.
I guess you could argue 2 Corinthians chapter 6, where Paul is establishing, he says he doesn't want to discredit the gospel. And he sort of makes himself out to be sort of a vagabond character in a way. I've been afflicted and hardship and distress and beatings and imprisonments. And he's saying, I don't do all this in order to pull away from the legitimacy. And as a general rule, we kind of would give less credibility to someone who says, I'm starting a new spiritual movement, but I spent a lot of time in jail. That's not exactly how you establish credibility.
Right.
But he's, in a way, it also is establishing that as Jesus predicted, it would be the fall of the sun, the moon, and the stars. It would turn the world upside down. And that being part of that, you're going to ruffle a lot of feathers, and people are willing to kill you. They're so ruffled. And so he's both saying, don't let that be a distraction to you, but in a way, it's also evidence of the impact that his ministry was having on the world.
Right. There's a whole element to this that we might talk about in a bit, where the suffering of the apostles, I believe, is one of the elements of evidence that they had a dedication to the beliefs that they believed in. Now, can someone suffer for a lie? Sure. Someone can believe a lie and be willing to suffer for it. I've heard people say before, the fact that these guys were martyred means the gospel is true. That's not the argument. That's not the right argument to make. The fact that these guys were martyred means they really believed the things that they taught were true. And we'll talk more about that in a bit, why I think that's still a good point to make as long as we present it in the right way. I think you had a hand up, Maurice?
I think Paul, really above a lot of the other apostles, is a great piece of evidence for the validity of the gospel, because while we tend to almost view the apostles as celebrities in a way, we celebrate them as being these great men, the reality is the culture in which they lived did not. They were very much downtrodden, and just some of the stuff Greg was talking about in 2 Corinthians 6 and 2 Corinthians 11 make it clear that for most people, they were viewed as the dregs of the earth that needed to be purged.
Mm-hmm.
But Paul began his career as a very prominent Jewish person with a lot of notoriety in and among the Jews. He was still notorious later, but for a much different reason, and was persecuted because of it. So the fact that he gave up this life of, I don't know, fame and fortune more than likely, knowing the majority of the Jewish leadership, among the Jewish people, that he gave that up to go and live a life as a vagabond and a sojourner and someone who was persecuted at every turn, is again not proof, but a piece of evidence.
Right.
For the fact that he certainly believed it, and would lend again credence to the fact that it's a true account of at least what he believed to be true. I mean, he's not trying to deceive people.
Yes.
Otherwise, he gave up a whole lot for nothing.
Yes. I wanted to talk about this point, so I'm glad you brought it up. In thinking about this, if Jesus was a hoax, if the resurrection is a hoax, and the apostles are just trying to perpetuate it as a hoax, I was trying to think, what's the closest parallel that we could maybe draw from our modern experience? And the closest thing I can think of is a cult, where there's a leader of a cult and there's people who follow after it. I can't remember, was Ted Bundy just a serial killer, or was he a cult leader? There's been famous,
Is where we get the phrase "drink the Kool-Aid."
Right, things of that nature, where there's a charismatic leader, there's often a spiritual or a otherworldly element to some of the things that they convince people of, and they can get people to be very, very dedicated to those beliefs, even to the point of committing crimes on the leader's behalf, or committing acts of violence, or mass suicides even. But what tends to be true of these cults and the people who are attracted to them, people are attracted to them typically when they are very lost, and people who people who have not been treated well by the world, people who have not been treated well by their circumstances, and they see an escape where I can be part of something, I can belong to something, I can have a sense of community or a sense of commonality with all these people. Those are very, very powerful, motivating factors. And so one could say, oh, the apostles, they were simple, they were poor, they had a reason to want to believe this hoax. But as Brace was saying, Paul was not an easy target for a cult. Paul was not someone who we would expect to fall to a charismatic cult leader, because Paul had stability. Paul had an education. Paul had prominence in the Jewish life that he had. He would see a cult as, well, these are a bunch of losers who are getting tricked by these poor fishermen. And he believed that, right? Because Paul was out to put a stop to this. He said this was some kind of heresy, this was some kind of false teaching. And so the complete 180 of Paul, someone who was as rational in his, we know Paul is a very rational writer in the way that he talks about reason and belief, and yet he is convinced by his witness of Jesus Christ when he was raised. It wouldn't take just seeing a mass of believers and disciples. Paul thought they're heretics or they're crazy, but when he saw Jesus and when he testified, I saw this resurrected Christ, and he made me know that this was all true, that this was all something to believe. His prominence would have not given him reason to believe otherwise. So I think that is very strong proof for Paul's conviction, and not only that, but that something did happen to him. I don't think someone of Paul's nature becomes convinced like that unless something really occurs. Brace?
Most of the movements that you were talking about, the cults and other things like that, ultimately, one characteristic of them is they're self-exterminating.
Yes, they tend to end.
But they all have in common that they don't last. Mm-hmm. Whether they end in mass suicide or not, they don't typically last more than a generation or two, and then they're gone.
Right.
So that again is a piece of evidence. This hoax, if it's a hoax, has been around for over 2,000 years now. Mm-hmm. So it would be the longest lasting hoax in the history of man, I would think. Mm-hmm. It's again, not proof, but a piece of evidence.
Right.
It's pretty significant.
Yeah, I would say so. Go ahead, Taylor.
Just names, a lot of names. So at the end of Romans, he says Greek, all these different people. At the end of really all of his letters, he says all of these different people, reading them, and not just their names, but some of their works, whether good or bad, of their works, of what they're doing, if they're hosting people, if they're laboring, just reference to a lot of different names.
Mm-hmm. Right, so the congenial nature of the epistles, and that they are clearly written to a group of people who, when they heard their name read in a letter to Paul, their ears would have perked up because they were a real person. And I think, too, another example of this criterion of embarrassment, criticisms of the churches and letters of retribution to the churches. You need to fix this problem. You have this sin among you that you're not dealing with. You've become lukewarm. The church's efforts to correct course and to stay on course in the early church history is recorded for us as well in the Gospels. You had a hand up. You can get the last comment, Brace.
Yeah, Taylor's point that she brings up is really interesting. I have not done a study of it myself, but the reality is we know that names typically are generationally popular. And the reality is that those who've studied things like language have looked at the New Testament just from the perspective of the names that are used, the ways in which they're used, and the frequency with which they're found, and found that they are very consistent with what is true historically in secular writings of Jewish people and Greek names that were common during that particular time period, and used with the frequency that you would expect based on the popularity of those names. And terms like Simon Bar-Jonah, we say, it's Simon, son of John. Well, the reason for that is because Simon was a very common name, as is evidenced in the New Testament. Right. And it was a way of differentiating. Or James the Less, James the Small One, as opposed to James the Big.
Or Judas not Iscariot. That was my favorite.
Yeah. So, those are just interesting things that, again, not all of us have the time to go to that length of searching, but it's a good piece of evidence that again leads credibility to the writings of the New Testament as being during that time period.
Right. So we're coalescing on a series of points that really gets to what are the key facts that the Gospels tell us about the resurrection. And what we're getting to is these are at least letters that came very soon after the events they describe. These are letters that, based on their copying, based on their preservation, are from the authors that they claim to be from. We're coalescing on these points. What we're going to eventually get to is, are they lying or are they telling the truth? So Wednesday, we're going to talk about some of the outside historical evidence, and then on the back of that lesson 4 sheet, I have a bunch of statements that a skeptic might say. And I want us to practice, how would you answer a statement like, the resurrection didn't happen, his followers faked a story to make people believe them, they were liars. How would you respond if someone said that to your face? We'll do that on Wednesday. Thank you for your time and attention this morning.